Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Serge Buy. I am the CEO of the Agri-Food Innovation Council, and I would like to welcome all of you to our third webinar in a series on the future of agri-food research and innovation in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. I will be your moderator for this session. I would like to first start by thanking the following organizations for partnering with us for this event. The first one being Farm Credit Canada, AgWest Bio being the second, and Osler, Oskin, and Arcort being the third one. Today's topic is about collaboration between researchers, industry, and entrepreneurs in the agri-food sector. Researchers visibly including academia. The key question underlying this event is how can we improve collaboration through the innovation spectrum, from research to adoption? To help us analyze the issue and discuss possible path forward, we are extremely pleased to have to welcome our panel of experts today. Joining us are Dr. Malcolm Campbell, Vice President of Research at the University of Guelph, Mr. John Ishkaw, President of Prairie Diversified and a board member of the Agri-Food Innovation Council, Dr. Peter Phillips, Distinguished Professor of the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy, and Mr. Martin Vetcher, Senior Investment Manager at Carrot Ventures. In just a moment, I will invite each of them to say a few words about themselves and their organization. But you will have noticed we gather this panel with different expertise and different experience in order to have a fulsome discussion. And I thank all the panelists for having agreed to participate here today. Before we begin our moderated discussion, I have a few technical notes to share. The chat bar will not be active for the attendees. That said, you are welcome and actually encouraged to ask your question using the Q&A button. If you see a question asked by another attendee that you like, you may upvote it in order to move it up in the queue. So that would be the process where you can go and push a question. If you prefer to ask your question verbally, please use the raise hand button next to the Q&A button. Once identified, you will be invited to unmute yourself to ask your question. Now, all this being said, I'm going to start asking each panelist to introduce themselves and their relation with the issue at hand today. And I'm going to do this in an alphabetical order, starting by Dr. Malcolm Campbell. Dr. Campbell.
Thank you, Serge. Bonjour tout le monde. C'est vraiment un plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui and to have the opportunity to speak to you from Canada's Food University, the University of Guelph. As Serge said, my name is Malcolm Campbell. I'm Vice President Research and at the university, something that I have the great pleasure and privilege to be doing there. I am speaking to you today from the university, and we are here on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron people, as well as the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We have a long and storied history of agriculture here that spans back millennia with the Indigenous people that reside on this land. And we're attached to this land through the dish with one spoon wampum, recognition that we have but one resource to gather, or one resource to share collectively together. And we must safeguard that resource carefully as we move forward in the future. It speaks, I think, metaphorically at least, to today's topic, which is really about innovation and how do we capture innovation. As I said, agricultural innovation has been occurring here for millennia. It's been intensified over the course of the last 150 years in this region, starting with the Ontario Agricultural College and proceeding to the University of Guelph, where we have a very solid history in mobilizing innovation in the agri-food sector. Going back a century ago with Charles Zavitz, for example, and AIC 21 barley, which utterly transformed the brewing and distilling industry in this country. Moving forward 50 years from that to Yukon Gold potato, the great innovation of Gary Johnson. Moving forward 25 years from that, David Woolen's fantastic innovation, Millennium asparagus. And the list goes on to this day with Ishvan Rashkan and many varieties of soybean that form the foundation of effectively, in the arc that I've just shared with you, a long-standing history of plant-based protein innovation, even though we frame it as being a modern thing. We've been doing it here for 150 years. And indeed, we innovate at University of Guelph across the agri-food sector, multiple verticals along entire verticals. Sometimes people talk about the field to fork continuum. At University of Guelph, we talk about the soil to saliva continuum, literally moving all the way from the field to the consumer. So it's a space that we innovate in very strongly. And one of the points that we'll be touching on today related to that is how we support and sustain that. We enjoy great governmental support at University of Guelph, in particular from the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, which infuses around $70 million a year to the Ontario Agri-Food Innovation Alliance, a world-leading platform that enables us to mobilize fundamental research discoveries into the innovation space and help power the agri-food sector here in Ontario, across Canada, and indeed around the world. It's a great pleasure to be here with everyone today. Those are my introductory remarks. I hope they've found it a good foundation for why I should be here today. Looking forward to joining the other panelists in our discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Campbell. And I know that the U of Guelph has been a strong supporter of AIC in the past, and we thank you for that. I'm going to move on to Mr. John Ishkaw. John.
Yes, I have to unmute myself. Well, Serge, thank you very much for inviting me onto this prestigious panel. I think I'm very lucky to hear what everyone else has to say, so I'm looking forward to this. A little bit about my background. I actually have, I think, a pretty good perspective from different angles. I used to head up the Saskatchewan Regional Economic Development Authority in the 90s when we focused on developing the agricultural biotech cluster in Saskatoon in the 90s. I've been an entrepreneur for probably over 20 some years, focused on building companies of technology, whether it be in agriculture or pharmaceutical. I am here as the president of Prairie Tide. Our focus of Prairie Tide is basically taking crops from Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba, or the prairies, and extracting high value compounds from those crops, as opposed to selling a metric ton of flax for $500–600. We want to sell 1 kilo of a flax molecule for $50,000. And so we want to put more processing in Canada. And part of the reason, and Prairie Tide actually was founded by a College of Agricultural professor at the University of Saskatchewan, Dr. Martin Rene. I'm also involved with a couple of other agricultural companies right now where we are licensing technologies from both other Canadian universities and an American university. We're also trying to do that with a Canadian institute, a research institute. So I'm involved with raising capital, licensing technology, and I think I've got some small business perspective. Hopefully we'll be able to add something to the discussion. And I'm also a farm boy from Saskatchewan.
Great. And we're almost in the Saskatchewan mafia, going especially to our next guest, Dr. Peter Phillips.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. I come from the University of Saskatchewan. I'm in a School of Public Policy, but I sort of cut my eye teeth in this area with the College of Agriculture. We live on the homeland, or in the areas and operate in the areas of Treaties 4 and 6, and on the homeland of the Métis. My particular interest is twofold. Living in a land-grant university in the center of the dryland agricultural industry in Western Canada and arguably in Canada, it's a natural place to examine how innovation happens. And sometimes we exceptionalize the agricultural sector, but in fact, the world looks to agriculture from a policy perspective because it's the one place we can actually see things happening. We can't see things happen in the digital world and in the health world and in other spaces because so much of it is behind commercial confidential systems. Whereas in the ag system, it's all transparent. So most of the ways that economists and policy people think about innovation were first tried and started around agricultural activities, either in Europe or in North America and other parts of the world. So I study the innovation system. both how it operates and how the different actors work together or work separately at cross purposes, and then how the policy system can contribute to better functioning and better outcomes of those systems. Differentially, I'm interested in those parts of the system where you get clusters of science-based agri-food innovation. There are clusters that have little or no innovation. They're simply about exploiting economies of scale. But I think the conversation today is about how do we bring forward new technologies, new ways of doing things that improve our productivity and profitability and environmental sustainability of the industry. So I'm, as a scholar, I'm interested, and as a practitioner in a policy school, I engage in creating some of these collaborative superstructures. I was part of the effort to build the social science space in the context of genomics research through the Genome Canada world, and I think I'm the only social science scholar who's been funded for the entire duration of the Genome Canada space, mostly on embedded science projects. So I'm the fly on the wall, trying to understand how they function, what they're doing, occasionally to provide some observations and advice on ways they might think of doing things differently. But I also build other systems of innovation where we bring either money people together, or people with ideas, or people with interests that are pursuing new ways of doing old things or new ways of doing new things. So I'll try and bring both those perspectives, what the theory and evidence says coming from the scholarship, but also what we've learned by building a whole bunch of new structures to motivate governments and industry and university and sometimes the not-for-profit sector to more actively bring new technology and new ideas into the agri-food space.
Thank you, Peter. Much appreciated. And now I will pass it on to Mr. Martin Vetter.
Thank you. And I think this is going to be some interesting conversation. I hope I've got enough to contribute as we go through with the experience and credentials of my panelists here. So I'll talk about Carrot Ventures, but also the backdrop organization, AVAC Limited, which probably many of you are well aware of. So I'm here, I guess, representing the investor community, very broad mantle that I'll carry for the purpose of this call. So AVAC has been around about 24 years, investing as a venture capital investor in agricultural technologies and more general technology sector. We have about 120 million of capital that we manage. We have in that time invested in about 120 companies directly, and we've either invested in or managed 10 other funds. So fairly broad spectrum of exposure from the investor's side. A lot of our direct investments were fairly early stage companies, often backing technical founders and lots of learnings over the years. And I guess the most relevant piece that I'll put forward is from the context of Carrot Ventures. So we're very pleased that FCC and AVAC agreed to come together and be the investors in this new fund called Carrot Ventures Fund 1. We announced it about a month ago. We have $15 million of capital, which is very specific business model of funding companies that we form. So the distinction I'm making here is that most investors will invest in an established existing company. We're flipping that a little bit and saying there's a lot of intellectual property, either research coming from an institution or intellectual property coming from a for-profit entity that should have another path to market. So not every researcher wants to be not every researcher wants to be an entrepreneur. Not every corporation has the resources to commercialize their inventions. So we looked at those two opportunities and said, there's a gap here in the marketplace. So why don't we build a business model on the basis of finding those technologies that should have a path to market and putting them in the hands of professional leadership and funding the company and going. So Carrot Ventures Fund 1, supported by AVAC and FCC. AVAC is the manager of the fund. We have a team of 3 core members, myself and another gentleman, Jim Harden, in Calgary. And we recently brought on another gentleman in Ontario, Alex Lazier, to help us from business development and technical due diligence perspective. I think that's enough for my introduction.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Martin. I really appreciate this. And that's a great segue. When I saw the creation of Card Venture, I think Warren sent it to me, Warren Bergen from MAVAC sent it to me. I thought this was a great opportunity to have it featured here for our discussion. I thought it would be a great idea to bring you into this discussion. I'm going to start by a general question that's probably led to by current events. A couple of days ago, the U.S. Congress passed a bill providing over $200 billion for research and innovation. It's to ensure that the U.S. could be more competitive in the face of China's growing economic influence. But it is going to give $200 billion more of government support because it is additional support to U.S. firms. One of the key things I hear from the sector is the usual complaint is we are great innovators, great inventors, and we bring it to fruition. And after that, the innovation goes south to the U.S. where we've lost all the benefit of it, or most of the benefit of it. This 200 and so billion will probably increase the delta between Canada and the US and make the US even more competitive. How do we react to this? How do we deal with an increasingly well-funded US that is increasingly competitive and potentially even more aggressive in acquiring new technologies? And how do we maintain Canadian invention in Canada to benefit our communities? So I'm going to start by this question, and the way I'm going to do this is by alphabetical order, but I do promise, Dr. Campbell, I won't start by you every time. I'm going to move after that and start by others, but I will start by you in the first question. And often I do hear that academia is wonderful at developing innovation, and then after that, they are purchased by someone in the US, and then it's gone. So can you help us with this?
Sure. So thanks, Serge, for the opportunity to speak. It does feel a little like a thesis defense when I have to start first and answer the tough questions, but as an academic, I hope to be able to manage it. The answer to your question, I think, is twofold. The first is I think we do need to continue with the excellent public sector funding that we have of our R&D infrastructure, our ecosystem here in Canada. We are leaders in the world by OECD measures in terms of public investment in the R&D ecosystem, in innovation. I think we don't want to be lagging in that particular space. But it strikes me that you're, and by the way, in that regard, I think we're incredibly blessed in the province of Ontario, as I mentioned at the outset, with this fantastic investment from the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs that recognizes that public investment is important for de-risking the future, for ensuring that there's a steady pipeline of innovations that are emerging to provide the technological developments, the processes that'll change to secure a strong future for the sector. We need to make sure that we grow that, and that we grow that in a way that matches our competitors. So you talked about the United States, and grow that in a way that certainly is outpacing, hopefully, inflation. But the other place where we need investment and where we need to make sure that we continue to have companies, innovators move forward to avoid the so-called valley of death, where the innovation is created and then it's either offshored, as you mentioned, so snatched up by a foreign interest, or just dies a death. We need to make sure that there's good private sector investment. It's fantastic that we have Martin here today. AVAC, FCC, and equivalent organizations have been investing in this space. And indeed, over the course of the last 5 years, there's been a 44% increase in investment in innovators here in Canada. Notably, though, 50% of that investment has come from the United States by investors out of the United States. And we need to be mindful of that and make sure that our domestic investment and domestic innovators stays apace of things. So I think that's one of the areas that we need to look at. Again, OECD measures, we're near the top in terms of public investment in innovation. We're near the bottom in terms of private sector investment in innovation. So that's one way that we can keep things moving forward. I want to give time for my other colleagues to speak, but I have two other answers to your question. And just as a bit of a teaser, I think that another problem that we have is getting trapped in some false narratives. And I think we've got some good examples of those that can be pointed to. And I think we've also got a problem that Peter is solving actually with regards to innovation literacy. But I'll leave time for my colleagues to speak and we can come back to those points.
Absolutely, and thank you. And John, I'm going to pass it on to you. You've raised this issue a few times, so please go ahead.
Well, first of all, I agree with you, Dr. Campbell, that the federal government and provincial governments need to continue to fund basic research and create technologies and innovation for companies to invest in. And I think that needs to increase to the level that the Americans do on a per capita basis. I also think we have to be very smart with our money, and there are ways that we can help companies get to market. And one thing that I would really like to see is the issue that I see time and time again, not just in agriculture, but in pharma, is the costs of regulatory, to getting products approved and protecting the intellectual property. It's always difficult for investors when they're looking at, they can sort of understand building a plant and equipment and some marketing dollars, but when you look at the additional costs of the regulatory to get into market, you know, in Canada, the United States, all these different jurisdictions, it would be great if we could leverage the infrastructure from the universities and institutes to actually help small companies get regulatory approval. Also, if the government could help, of course, you can only focus on the Canadian side, maybe North American, help us in regards to filing patents and claims to reduce the costs in regards to that. Because I find whenever I'm budgeting and I have to spend $100,000 for patents and claims and changes to those claims, it's like dead money to me. But if I don't do it, investors won't come in because I've got limited protection. But I am doing some things, exciting things in Saskatchewan, where the Saskatchewan government is trying to leverage some of their infrastructure so I can get approvals for some of my, the products that I'm involved with. So that's one way. Americans don't think that way. And so I think that's one of our advantages. And the other thing that I think we need to do, and I think Canadians are already good at it, but to strengthen that is partnering with each other to leverage the resources of other SMEs, but other institutes where this week I had some Americans up on another deal, and we were doing a pilot in a hospital, and the hospital didn't have the equipment that they thought they had. But it's amazing, the hospital called the College of Vet Med and they were able to get the piece of equipment. The Americans from Austin, Texas said that would never happen in Texas. So we have some advantages that we need to exploit. The other thing that I'm really excited to see is how venture capitalists and family offices, private investors are looking at Canada, and accessing capital is not as difficult as it was 10 years ago, as long as you're fair on valuation. So anyway, I'll leave it with that.
Great. Dr. Phillips.
I totally agree with the first two speakers, Malcolm and John. Money and resilience of our policy systems are important, but they're part of that supply push model we're talking about right now, which is that we invent things here, we push them to the market, and we hope to have some impact. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's part of the portfolio. I think part of what's missing in some of the national conversation is the fact that even in our best sector, we might be contributing 5% of the effort globally. You know, if we use the most optimistic numbers we have in Canada, we're 5% of the world's effort. We ignore the other 95% in the conversation. That's where the high returns are, is adapting and adopting the best from the world, and not exclusively focusing on what we as as inventors can produce and push into the market. So I think, going to a bit of the question that I saw in the thing, where does that leave institutions like universities? Rather than exclusively thinking about invention and commercialization, which is a valuable contribution to the space, we should also be thinking about adapting and adopting the best of the world. So they call it providing the absorptive capacity to our system. And we do bits of that in the crop space. I think we do it very well. Our varieties hit the market on time, and they're highly competitive with world varieties. But in much of the rest of the system that's in and around the varieties and maybe some of the animal pedigrees, we're sort of hung up in systems. We're hung up in it has to be ours, and we're hung up in complying with the unique Canadian problems, and yet the world is our oyster. I mean, this is a global industry. It's not a Canadian industry. And if all we do is satisfy the Canadian system, we've truncated. We're less than 1% of the world's population, actually about half a percent. Assuming we eat slightly more than the average, maybe we buy 1% of the world's food. There's 9% of it, the market out there that needs our technologies and the products we produce with our technology. So I think there's a conversation that gets lost as we focus on invention and forget about the bigger question, which is just big borrowing and stealing what's the best in the world and making it work for us. It's a bit of tinkering, but I think all of the institutions do it. We just don't talk about it.
Great. Thank you. Martin, would you like to take a stab?
Oh, that's such a big question you asked, and I'm sure you'll ask some other questions that will let us tackle it a bit more. There's always the trite comment that success breeds success. And so from a Carrot Ventures, I guess from the investor perspective, why do investors get into an opportunity? What keeps them away from an opportunity? And again, back to the premise of Carrot Ventures, as we were building the model, there's a lot of good technology that gets developed in Canada. So kudos to our research institutions, universities, and our for-profit companies. But often the investor will look at something, look at an opportunity, and they'll walk away because the talent is not adequate in their opinion to drive this to a successful opportunity. So what we see happening is the companies that are successful, the people that are involved in that journey, they learn some things. A lot of things, because entrepreneurship is a learned skill, as is being a scientist or an accountant or an engineer. And the people that are part of a successful venture, they learn what works, what doesn't work, and they'll try the next time and the third and the fourth time, and each time they get better and better at it. So from the investor perspective, when we look at an opportunity, often it's great technology, great market, solving a real problem. But if the team is not strong enough, then we'll walk away and look for another opportunity that has all the elements that are needed for success. So as entrepreneurs go through that path, get that experience, then they do their second deal, third deal, then the investments community starts looking at them and saying, okay, now you've got the experience, you've got the credentials to be supported and backable by this opportunity. So back to the Carrot Ventures model, recognizing that, what we are doing very specifically is once we've identified technology that we believe, in our opinion, flawed as it is, solves a substantive market problem, we then actively recruit a professional to be the founder, CEO of that company. And it's a recruiting exercise. What we found, so we formed one company, formed one company. We have a financing term sheet issued. The recruiting firm that we used looked at 650 odd resumes. They interviewed about 200 people. They brought forward a dozen to us. Of those dozen, I can think that 2 of them were Canadians. The rest of them were living south of our border. The person that we hired is based in the States. So that just to me reinforces that great technology. The technology came from Southern Ontario. There were, a couple of, as I said, a couple of candidates in the Canadian talent pool. One of them just didn't have domain expertise. The other one chose not to go down the risk-reward profile path of the entrepreneurial journey, and got to respect that. The ones that really showed interest and affinity to being a founder of a company were south of the border. So the talent gap is a significant factor. And that's not something that one can change overnight. That's a generational thing where you have to go through the experience of entrepreneurship, building those companies, going through the exits, and then going back at it again.
Great, thank you very much. I appreciate that answer. I want to go back to Dr. Campbell. You started teasing us with the false narratives that we need to avoid. So I'm going to give it back to you.
Thanks very much, Serge. And I want to thank all my fellow panelists for really shading in, I think, some great comments on the previous question. In some ways here, I'm riffing on what Peter was talking about as well. False narratives around the dependency of the innovation ecosystem on innovation push as opposed to innovation pull. And Peter spoke explicitly to this in his remarks. I double down on that and say that as we grow out the ecosystem, we need to make sure that the two are in balance in many ways. We need to make sure that we're working together with new innovations, SMEs that are creating a new intellectual property position for themselves, providing opportunities for them to grow and sustain their business, to scale it, to get to market and get to international markets, to Peter's point, not be reliant on our domestic markets, to make sure that they're capturing the opportunity that's out there. But equally, also to Peter's point, we need to be making sure that we're paying attention to working with, for example, companies that are already generating revenue. They may already be big players in the world. There's a temptation in Canada to be a little afraid of multinationals. I don't know where this fear comes from. They do great work in our country. IBM, for example, employs 14,000 Canadians and does billions of dollars worth of business in our country. So we should be working with people that are at that level of doing their business, adapting their technologies, their way of moving forward, so as to advance the entire industry. So I have a credo. It's when presented with a choice, choose both. So we should be right across the entire innovation ecosystem, not trapped in a false narrative that it should be all about MNEs or all about SMEs, pardon me, but also making sure that we're working together with MNEs. And I would say, and I'm going to be maybe a little political at this point in time for an academic, to say that we're trapped oftentimes in a false narrative as it relates to innovation in this country. Largely, frankly, from a lot of bandwidth that's occupied by a failed executive from a failed company who seems to get a lot of bandwidth in this country, and who paints a narrative that says, for example, that innovation is trapped within the academic ecosystem and it is not released, it's not unleashed, that people like myself, Vice President's research, are sitting with intellectual property that is gathering dust in filing cabinets. Believe me, that's not the work that I'm involved in. I'm out there hoofing it all the time, making sure that we're commercializing the research that we're doing and that we have IP behind. So there's a false narrative that's developed out there, and it's one that I think that we would do well to correct, because I believe actually it's hindering us. It's hindering us in our progress. I've mentioned one already, which is the SME versus MNE issue, but there are many others. There's the Peter Pan hypothesis that all good innovation comes from young people. Well, again, to my mind, when presented with a choice, choose both. It's when all get together, when we take advantage of diversity, that we see the best innovation emerge. So some really facile notions that are out there, creating some false dichotomies that really aren't true. We need to be busting them down, because that's how we're going to make the ecosystem better.
Great comments, and I do agree with you on some of those issues. Absolutely. I'm going to go to a question already asked by a member of the audience, and it's been partially responded by some of you, but I'll still put it back there. Peter, you started to address it, but I'd like you to take another stab. It is addressed to academics, but I'm going to open it up to John and Martin once you, Peter, and Malcolm respond to it a little bit, although you've already somewhat addressed it. But the question is, what elements and approaches could Canadian universities and colleges, I should say, adopt to boost research commercialization, technology transfer, and partnerships with the private sector? Peter.
I mean, I think some of the universities do that very well already. So they're, rather than saying we have to reinvent the wheel, I think we can look inside Guelph, Saskatchewan. Many universities in Canada in different sectors have found ways of motivating teaching into scholarship, into technological innovations that then get quite effectively pulled into the marketplace. So we have some really good models, but what can we do that's better? I think at the institutional level of universities, we have a challenge that that many of our incentives as faculty members truncate the supply chain that we're talking about. There's little or no incentive to do the non-discovery knowledge translation. I mean, we all do it because especially in land grant institutions, because that's part of our mission, but it doesn't count towards tenure and promotion and other things the way a publication in a top journal would, or having a top student go through your program. So there's an institutional challenge inside. I had another thought that was rolling around in my head, but I've lost it. I'll come back to it if I get it. But I think institutionally we have more we could do there that would open us up to these continuous chains, not just truncated exercises.
Malcolm?
Thanks, Serge. I'm actually going to, I'll definitely agree with everything that Peter just said, totally in agreement. John said something earlier in the conversation that I thought was really interesting, and that is that universities and colleges have assets that enable them to help companies navigate some of the tricky elements of research and development and make sure that products are getting to market. And John was explicitly referring to the challenges associated with regulatory, effectively de-risking the movement of a product from the prototyping stage or from the pre-market stage into the market. And I think that's definitely a place that universities can be operating. We do it within the Ontario Agri-Food Innovation Alliance, our partnership with OMAFRA, because in many ways we're supported and promoted in doing that sort of work. To Peter's point, is that actually there is a benefit to our faculty members to be participating in that program, not the least of which, because as Peter defines us, we are effectively a Canadian version of a land grant university. It's written into the 1964 Guelph Act that in fact we will engage in doing innovation for the agri-food sector to sustain it. So having that embedded within the DNA of institutions, I think will obviously help that occur. But then also I think structurally, there are things that we can be doing to move things along the innovation pipeline. As I just mentioned, making use of our platforms to help companies de-risk, to help them prototype, to help them effectively improve their products for market competitiveness. We operate a platform through the Ontario Agri-Food Innovation Alliance that I love. I love that it's production scale, but not production dependent. That allows us to test new technologies in a production environment at production scale. And because we aren't reliant, as farmers are, for example, on being productive, it doesn't impinge on our bottom line. It's what we're meant to be doing. And that can really help ensure the adoption of those technologies. So having those platforms, onboarding companies and allowing them to test their technologies on that platform, whether they're an SME or an MNE, that's the way to move forward. Final thing that I would say in that regard is to make sure that there's a robust ecosystem that helps with both, on the one hand, innovation push, and on the other hand, innovation pull. So at University of Guelph, like many other institutions, like Saskatchewan, for example, we operate obviously a very active IP office, a technology transfer office, but we also do new venture creation. So we've got an incubator platform that helps new companies emerge and get founded on the basis of those technologies. But similarly, we've got technology transfer opportunities that allow us to work with companies that are already in market to help them improve on existing processes or technologies and really help them ensure that they've got market competitiveness. So having that ecosystem growing out and working in that way is what's allowed us at University of Guelph to be 4 times the national average in terms of invention disclosures, to be one of the most partnered universities in Canada. And maybe the final thing that I'll say is because I've talked a lot about University of Guelph, is to say the other thing that I think would make a big difference and really help commercialize and improve the innovation ecosystem in this country is if we networked more. We tend to be very parochial in our view. We tend to be very embedded in our own regions. I will say, and I'll be a little political here again, the Innovation Supercluster Program and the Strategic Innovation Fund have not been helpful in this regard. They've reinforced regionalism and they've created, again, another false narrative that innovation is regionally embedded. It's not. It's distributed across the country. And in the agri-food sector, it's really distributed. My grandfather, before MacGyver existed, MacGyvered his tractor all the time to make sure he wasn't spraying the ditch, but he was spraying his crops. And that continues today. We've got innovators across the sector that are everywhere, and we need to find ways to network them, and that's how we're going to be able to commercialize technologies and be competitive on a global basis. And there are people doing that in Canada, but I've spoken enough, and I can come back to that if there's time later.
Well, I'm going to ask John and Martin to react. Martin first. I saw your hand getting up.
Yeah, no, so of course agree with much of what has been said. So from the commercial, and we are working with both University of Guelph and University of Saskatchewan, and you got some great team members there, so appreciate that, some great research. My ask from the commercialization side is that IP policies need to be aligned with business. And so what I mean by that is from the investor perspective, if we are being asked to support a company where there is a royalty structure back to the inventor of the technology, the universities, that is a drain on cash flow. And that makes it very difficult for the investors to fully align with it. What we ask for and look for is the assignment of the IP, and then in exchange for an allocation of founder shares in the company. So from the investor perspective, that means that there's alignment, there's clarity of ownership, there's a path to, because of that ownership, there's a path all the way through to what's the return to the investors and to the inventors, because at some point, the expectation is that there's a go public event or an acquisition event, and that is how the financial return rolls back to all the participants along the way. So from the investor perspective, the ability for the intellectual property to be assigned to a company is hugely beneficial in the ability to commercialize and take it to market. Maybe a bit controversial, but it's a big request, big ask.
Great. John?
Well, I've done both in regards to equity with the university and with the royalty, and I agree with you. I actually find most universities and their tech transfer departments are always trying to accommodate industry. There's a will that they want to do it. I think they could probably become a little bit more efficient, a little quicker in regards to turnaround. There's some things that could be tweaked, but I'm going to throw a little bit of a grenade into this. My grenade is that I've been talking to producer groups, and the farmers that are funding a lot of the research through these producer groups are getting angry and are getting frustrated, because they feel they will help a great researcher, whether it be University of Saskatchewan, Alberta, Guelph. They'll fund the research, and then they'll find that it's been licensed to a multinational, or it's been licensed to another company that gives the benefit to American farmers, Ukrainian farmers, European farmers, before they get to see the varieties. And a lot of them are questioning whether they should do the checkoff. So when we're talking about all of these things, I think the existing model where the producer groups help leverage funding from the federal government, they're going to be demanding a lot. And they'll be demanding that Canadian farmers get the first use of the variety for so many years for competitive advantage. Two, that a Canadian SME is the vehicle for commercialization. And I think that that's how, Martin, you'll get a lot more in management experience when there's some of that funneling. So I've been talking to these producer groups over the last 12 months, and I've seen their frustration go from a 2 to about a 10. And I think that that's a sleeping dog that's going to make everyone aware within the next 12 months on how their funding is spent. So be prepared for that. So it's a little bit different than the multinational. I'm saying let's keep it here first and let the commercialization happen through Canadian SMEs.
And John, we would not have invited you if you were not going to be controversial. So thank you for obliging us. Any reaction to what John and Martin have said from either one of you, Malcolm or Peter? And I see Malcolm, you've already.
If I may, just to say, agree with John entirely. And I spend a lot of time with producer groups. I'm a member of President's Council, which is the producer group amalgam here in the province of Ontario. Spent a lot of time talking to Ontario bean growers, grain farmers of Ontario, and this issue around germplasm and offshoring, if you will, new varieties is something that we both understand and make sure that doesn't occur. And a great point, John, around there being time limitations put on that, because there's actually some great benefit that can be returned to the industry. Some of our international competitors are behind us in terms of their varieties, and they might like to buy some stuff that we're not interested in that's like 10 years old, but we can still bring some money back to the industry through that. So great point and 100% in agreement. That's why we operate that way. I think we're somewhere probably less than 10%. I'd have to take a look at our numbers, but 10% in terms of foreign license agreements on germplasm in particular. The rest is with Canadian companies and largely with CCAN, as you can imagine. So so I agree with John in that point. Both John and Martin raised the issue around licensing agreements and whether it should be effectively whole-scale turnover of the IP to the company with which you're partnering versus royalty payment versus some ongoing commercialization fee. And we do all models and work with people and irrespective of the of what it is that they how do I want to frame this? We work according to our partners' interests, but wanting to make sure, and I think this is really important, we are public institutions, and we want to make sure also that there's a return to the public purse on those opportunities when IP has been developed. Never really run into any issues in that regard, and about 50% of the royalty income that we have at University of Guelph is precisely from licensing agreements, largely on germplasm, some and livestock development. So really focusing on partners' interests, what the partners want, that's been what served us best. And I suspect that's what'll serve others best as well. I see Peter's got his hand up and I'll shut up.
I'm going to add that thought I lost because I think it complements some of what's been said here. You know, part of the question is how do we assist the opportunities to reach use in whatever pathway is appropriate. And one of the things I've observed, having been embedded in science-based projects that every one of them has said, we're going to invent something that the market wants, and we're going to judge ourselves based on the impact in the market. Not one of those grants has been long enough to get even close to the first stage of commercialization. And so all the stuff we're talking about is off book. It's beyond the research space that we are incentivized to be in the scholarly community. And so that's a major problem. It breaks continuity. It drops things into this never land of nobody being responsible for moving it forward. And it's just as true in the social sciences as it is in the natural sciences and the engineering space. The money stops before you get to the point of actually figuring out how do we use this and where do we use this and how do we make it work for the market and for the economy and for society. And that's if we're going to do that for the academy, we then need somebody else to step in and do it behind us. But right now, the presumption is that we do that off the corner of our desk, and it doesn't work that well. That's the to me, a structural problem that we've created. And that's, we used to have grants that were 7 years renewable. Now the average grant is 3 years, non-renewable. What technology can you tell me that is going to be invented and reduced to practice and scaled up in 3 years? Maybe a piece of an app on a phone, but not much else that we're talking about in the food space.
COVID vaccines, Peter.
Okay, but they had 20 years ahead of them.
Peter, if I could just add to that, you talk about the 7 years. What's very frustrating from an SME's perspective is sure there are IRAP, there's a number of things for science development. Well, you wonder why we're dropping the ball on commercialization. If you actually apply to get funding to hire a young marketing research grad to help you with that, you can't get it. For some reason, the government doesn't appreciate that side of it. And my one other little comment is, I think the universities are trying hard to work with industry, but the federal government institutes don't seem to have the same drive. Like I find that it's more difficult to deal with NRC or Ag Canada on some licensing or business issues than it is a university.
Well, thank you for this. We thought we were not going to fill the full time, and we're 52 minutes already into the meeting, and I haven't gone through 3/4 of my questions. So I'm going to, and thank you for this. This is great, great discussion so far. I'm going to go through another question that we have for you. And in terms of during the AIC summit in May, one of our panelists talked about the valley of death, and I know you've somewhat addressed it in agri-food innovation. In short, significant resources and efforts are allocated at the beginning and end of the spectrum, but relative to the middle part, development and prototyping. Is there a valley of death? Do you see the valley of death that impedes research from being commercialized? And in general, are there other gaps within the innovation spectrum? And we have a question from one of our attendees as well, and board member, Dr. Raj Lada, who indicates as well, there is very little money for startups as well. How can we promote new entrepreneurs on that front? So the two-part question: new entrepreneurs, and is there a valley of death, and is there other gaps? And now I'm going to move to John to answer that first. John.
Yes, I think there is a valley of death, but it's different ways of looking at it. I find that you can normally raise capital once you've made an exciting invention and have got some validation, because the amount of money you need to actually validate it isn't that much normally. Where I think the valley of death really happens is when you know you have a product and you're trying to develop the market for it in the initial stages to actually raise a lot of money. It's really difficult to get the production levels up. Like there's some incubator toll facilities, but even those are expensive. I find that is an area where it's difficult to get funding or financing in that sort of gap. Is one area. So I definitely think there is a valley, and it's getting better though. Canadian investors, American investors are now looking at Canada and supporting industry. So there is a valley, but it's not as bad as it used to be. In regards to helping entrepreneurs, if you're a scientist and you want to start a business, I would recommend you partner with a business person that has gone through this process in the past, and they'll help you get through the process. We'll probably have some ability to help you find some funding. I find that the governments do help through IRAP and NRC. They do have some funding for guys, but partner yourself with a guy that's been through the trenches before, and they'll help you.
I agree, John. But Peter, any answer on this?
Yes, let me observe. We have a sense that Canada somehow lags the world. The Valley of Death is not a Canadian phenomenon; it's a global phenomenon. Especially in the agri-food space. A colleague of mine at Colorado State did a study of 560 disclosures that got to the proof of concept in the agro-bioscience space. Of those 560, only 383 got to any form of trialing, even though they got to proof of concept. Another 47 got to advanced trials, 14 got applied for regulatory access, 5 got to market, 2 were sustained in the market. So we're talking about a fraction of 1% of those things that get to proof of concept that ever get to market in the world that actually has entrepreneurial and financial support for these kinds of innovations. And that's only the tip of the iceberg, because there's I've heard estimates of anywhere from 1 in 10 to 1 in 100 great ideas ever get to the IP office for consideration and reduction to use. So we're talking about the tip of the iceberg of the research space that doesn't get that actually gets attention, and then a vanishingly small part of those actually get use. So this isn't a uniquely Canadian problem. This is a global problem, and it may be our expectations. It may be that we're looking at the wrong things, because while we're looking at these things that are intellectual property protected, there's a whole bunch of other things that just get picked up and used. The IP languishes, but the actual concepts and the insights get adapted and used quite widely with little or no formality and little or no measurement. So I think there's a risk that when we exceptionalize innovation as tech that has been protected through intellectual property, we look at a vanishingly small part of the world and ignore a lot of things that are really driving our prosperity and our technological improvements in the industry.
Great. Martin, would you like to comment on this?
Oh, please. This is a great topic. So yes, absolutely. There is this notion of valley of death that applies to every sector, every geography, every industry. Again, from the investor perspective, I will volunteer that every opportunity at every stage thinks that there is not enough capital. And I'm sure researchers will say that there's not enough capital available and they have to compete for it. Is that a bad thing? If there's a later stage company that's already proven some things, they will often say that there's still not enough capital to fund their opportunity. Is that a bad thing? That, to me, that there's a bit of driving excellence and a high performance that is beneficial to everybody. The good opportunities, convinced, do get funded. I think that's a, not universally, but as a general rule, the good research, the good technologies, the good teams will get funded. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad way to do it. I think one of the challenges that is specific to what we're generally calling the valley of death is that we're going from research and perhaps early commercialization into more of a growth, mass market growth stage of commercialization. And there's a fundamental difference in the skill set that's required. And that, again, back to my theme of the talent piece in the equation. Once you've got an established organization, you've got the team, the structure, the process systems in place, there's a bit of the organization just knows what it needs to do and it continues on and hopefully gets better and better at that. When you're going from the research phase through the proof of concept into early commercialization stages, then the shift from the organization's needs starts shifting from research and initial product instantiation to how do I build and run a business? That's a different skill set, a different mindset. And if the organization doesn't make that shift and put in the talent in place to do that, then they get stuck in that valley of death.
Great. Malcolm, do you want to say a few words on this?
Sure, recognizing we're short on time. I'm going to take the questions in reverse order with regards to incubation and opportunities to incubate. I think they abound. And in fact, I had the sense a couple of years ago that every Friday evening alcohol-fueled idea of a great company was getting an opportunity to be founded here in Canada, unfortunately. And and we were ending up with a very highly incubated ecosystem, and one where we weren't really moving things through into a well-established IP-founded ecosystem. And I'm really glad to see that ICED, FedDev have recognized that we don't need more incubation, we need more acceleration, we need more scaling. We need to really help companies be competitive. So that's my answer to the second question. With regards to Valley of Death, I think we'd want to ask ourselves the question, what and why, and whether it's more exacerbated or whether it's different here in Canada. I agree with everything that Peter, John, and Martin have already said around this not being a uniquely Canadian problem. But I wonder if there are things that are uniquely Canadian about our Valley of Death here in Canada. So as to be able to create a nice loop between something that I talked about earlier, I believe there is a unique element to it. It is tied a little bit to this false narrative piece that I was talking about earlier. I believe it's really tied, though, strongly to not IP literacy, but innovation literacy, and understanding what it means to innovate, what it means to take something through the entire pathway of innovation. Thank goodness for centers like Peter's Center that are improving our understanding of science and innovation policy. They're helping with this innovation literacy, as I would describe it. But here in Canada, we have a woefully uninformed public, I would say in general, and even in academia, understanding of innovation. Largely informed, unfortunately, by watching Dragon's Den on television. I think that we are actually hindered and not advanced by watching Dragon's Den that talks about things like unicorns, picking winners, not doing due diligence, proper due diligence, everything being based on the pitch and not really taking a good hard look and having evidence-based decisions to help companies move through the innovation arc and be successful as they move out there. So as I said, thank goodness to organizations like Peter's who are addressing this. And thank goodness, I saw in the chat, I saw Dave Smarden there, who's been working on Canada's Agri-Food Innovation Engine, which I think is also helping to address some of this understanding. We need our academics to do what they're able to do in the Netherlands, in Israel, and in the UK. I think I'd be a little bit afraid to conduct a survey to ask, what are technology readiness levels and how do you relate to them, and how does your research and development relate to them to most Canadian innovators? I don't think they even know what TRLs are. And until we have minimally that level of understanding in the ecosystem, we aren't going to be able to advance it the way that we need to. So I'm making the case today for some innovation literacy that I think might help us deal with some of the problems that we have in the Valley of Death.
Yeah, and Malcolm, I do agree. The innovation literacy, the adoption issue, we used to spend much more money 20 years ago on adoption and helping innovators as well. We are not doing as much now. Sure. And that's probably resulting from different cuts. Peter.
May I just add a summative statement to what Malcolm said? I think as scholars of innovation, we've fixated on special people doing special things in special places, and that leads to focusing on heroic innovators and unicorns, and those are largely mythical, especially in the agri-food space. So we completely ignore all the hard graft, the slogging work that the industry does, and that I think that permeates the policy space as well. That we're looking for quick wins rather than sound, solid change in our agri-food capacity and performance.
Can I chime in and just say, here, Peter? And can we also do away with the words collision and disruptive, please?
All right. John, did you want to say something?
No, I was just going to say, can we also get rid of the word pivot?
All right, we're redoing the English language. I did want to go back to the comments from our audience, and Emily Rapp put out a website here in the link that's useful. Emily works as a trade commissioner for Canada and the US. So thank you, Emily, for doing this. If anyone wants to see it, it will be in the answered links, answered questions, and So that will be there. Ron Couric definitely agreed with you, Peter, on the Valley of Death. And I want to go back to Dave's comment, Dave Smartin, another board member of AIC. It looks like finally we've got most of our board members on the call today. I do want to go back on the regionalization and clusters approach. And Malcolm, you're the one who approached this. You said that was political as a comment, and indeed it is in Canada, the regionalization approach that we've had. There's a lot to be said about regionalization, but there's a lot to be said about the lack of resources that we have in Canada, and the fact that we are often duplicating models in various provinces just because they are in different provinces. So we will have the province A center for this and the province B center for that, just because every province needs to have their center for something. And as a result, we're duplicating overhead, and we're diluting our efforts. And part of that, and I think that's one of the things Dave has mentioned in a call not long ago that I attended, is we don't have a national innovation policy for agri-food research. And maybe we don't have a national strategy, I should say. So is that part of the issue in here? The fact that we don't have a national strategy, and we are a regional country, where we are a confederation, and that has limitations for our innovation process. I'm going to start with you, Malcolm, because you raised the issue first. So I'm going to start with you, and then after that, I'll go to Martin, John, and Peter.
I'll try to keep it brief. Yes, I think it's the answer to the question. I think having a policy would be a good thing to do. We've great discussions are occurring right now, obviously, around the next policy framework, the son of CAP, so to speak, and what should happen there. I was part of a consultation session that was run by the Minister of the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs here in Ontario, sitting amongst commodity groups. John, listening to what people were saying there, and clearly there is a hunger to have a more consolidated, focused way of dealing with some of the major challenges for innovation here in the country. And actually, I'm really speaking here on something that Peter is by far and away the expert on this. But my simple-minded view on this is that there would be some advantages, just like we've got a national food policy now, to have some form of national agri-food innovation policy. With the following caveat, I would be adverse to it if it says that there's a geographic center to it. We again, false narrative. We're stuck in this crazy federal narrative that the agri-food sector is somehow embedded in 3 provinces in this country, and that's where innovation is occurring. It's wrong-minded, and it's not going to advantage us. It's not going to allow us to realize the ambitions of the 2017 Advisory Council on Economic Growth report, the so-called Barton report, if we remain trapped in this facile regional perspective on things. Just as advanced manufacturing shouldn't live only in Ontario, and artificial intelligence only in Quebec, neither should the agri-food sector and its innovation reside solely in 3 provinces. So if we do have a policy, it's got to be all embracing and really talk about how we're creating a national capacity, not some sort of quasi-regional capacity.
Yeah, and Malcolm, I do agree with you. I mean, it was interesting to see that all the clusters covered the 5 regions of Canada in the way: the Prairies, BC, Ontario, Quebec, and Atlantic Canada. My God, what a coincidence that was. And visibly, we are dealing with politics, and maybe one part of the issue is taking politics out of it, but that's not going to happen in Canada. It's part of our who we are. Martin, do you want to comment on this?
Oh, I think others have got more to contribute on this particular question than I do.
Okay, that's fair. John?
I'll be really quick. I would be very interested to see what policies were developed in the 50s and 60s to help develop the food industry and some of the ag sectors, and just revisit when were we successful as opposed to trying to invent a new wheel. We might have had great policies 50, 60 years ago. Let's check them out.
Okay. Peter?
Let me make a couple of quick observations. Malcolm's right, we don't have a national policy. We really don't have a national policy on innovation, period. We have national programs, and I always use the example of the New Yorker magazine where it was the world from Fifth Avenue. And you can see a couple of tall buildings, and then you see a couple of mountains, and then you see an ocean, and then you see something else. It's like looking through the back end of a pair of binoculars. That's Ottawa. They see that they've developed a national policy. But the reality is at the provincial and local levels, everybody cherry picks and builds takes from the smorgasbord and builds a policy that works for them. Now, some of that's forced by federal policy. The CAP and in its predecessors, and probably the new one, artificially draws boundaries that truncate activity that could cross regions and could cross Canada. In spite of that, industry, as Malcolm's point, and the academy, as Malcolm's pointed out, do reach across the boundaries. I always point to the example of Genome Canada, which when it started, the original idea was that they would have national centers located regionally that would drive some of the global science that we wanted to be involved in. Instead, we got regional centers that had to figure out how to compete against each other instead of become the center for Canada. They have migrated to areas of specialization, but in spite of the incentives and the rules. And so we truncate domestically. And I'll throw the other one in just because I think it's part of our national psyche. We truncate ourselves from the world. I remember we had a World Wheat Summit here in Saskatoon about 10, 15 years ago. Every multinational company, every major scientist in the wheat space, all the international centers were in the room on the top of a hotel building. And the message from most of the international partners that we actually were major funders of was that you send us great gobs of money, but you never send us your people. You never come and see what we're doing. And you compare that to our American colleagues who get a return of about 100 to 1 for every dollar they put out in these systems. They bring $100 of value back into their industrial space. We seem to have this view that if we're doing good, we can't do well at the same time. And yet they want us to take up and use these technologies in our agri-food space. So we stovepipe and create a tableau of regional and local systems of innovation. And then we truncate it from the international system. And it's the individual investigators, and some of them are on the line today, who actually reach beyond and probably break rules to actually take advantage of the global capacity and the interprovincial capacity that exists, because it's certainly not encouraged in most of our programming.
Appreciate that, Peter. Thank you very much. And I'm going to go to another question. And governments can be seen as both enablers and obstacles to growth. And you've all addressed it in this. We know that there will be significant belt tightening exercises in the next 2 years. I mean, let's face it, we can't continue to have $300 billion deficits on an annual basis. Where and how should government focus their efforts to enable growth through commercialization of agri-food research and innovation? And specifically, what do organizations such as venture capital groups, such as yourselves, Martin, see the role of the government in the future on the funding of innovation? Martin, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, another big question I like posing for us. Government, sort of building on the last question, government's role clearly is setting direction, setting policy, aligning the mind share of the country around what are the important things that need to be dealt with, and setting our direction for the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years. That clearly is the domain of government, and that role's the next step after that would be, once you've got some of those policies and frameworks in place, what's the role of government funding to drive the research work that leads to innovation that eventually works its way through? And I think in general, government does that, putting aside the question of whether it's being done effectively at the policy and the strategy level. But there's certainly a lot of government support for the research work that we need to conduct. Where it switches over to industry is that industry generally has a better track record of picking winners and trying to make the informed opinion of here are more near-term market problems that should be getting the attention of the commercialization community. There's obviously a shorter time horizon that industry works with on that. But for me, that's really what the government is trying to, or should be setting that 10, 20, 30, 50-year horizon guidance, providing the funding that establishes the primary research that then needs to work its way into industry to move it forward. Let industry start choosing what the winning technologies are. Let industry try and influence and saying, we know that thing, or the indicators are that these are some particular areas that as a country we've got skills and we need to migrate and push forward. So there's some interplay between those two, but let industry make the decisions on what are the winning technologies and winning opportunities, because that's what industry is trained to do. Let government set the longer term framework and guidelines that enables it.
Malcolm, to you for a short answer, if possible.
Sure. I agree with Martin, having industry set priorities. And I think here in the province of Ontario, the way the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs operates provides exactly that sort of opportunity for the R&D questions to be driven by industry. And that effectively then creates the innovation questions, if you will, the solutions that we're meant to be creating through the Ontario Agri-Food Innovation Alliance at University of Guelph. I said at the outset, it's a global model for how to do things. And I would say we should be taking a look at those sorts of models going forward. And I know that the BC government, for example, recently did a review of how they should be funding agri-food R&D and innovation in the province, and looked at that particular model, the Ontario model, and said, this is the one that we should probably be adopting. So I think adopting that and making sure to scale it properly going forward. I heard your comment right at the outset, Serge, about this being a belt tightening time. I don't know whether it should be a belt tightening time for the agri-food sector. It's remained resilient through the pandemic. It remained resilient through the 2008, 2009 downturn. And I think we need to make sure that it remains not only resilient, but a driver for economic growth, a creator of prosperity going forward in the future. Let's make sure we realize the ambitions of that 2017 AIC report. This is not the time to be cutting back. As I've said, R&D investments in the agri-food sector is like an insurance policy. And let me tell you, this is not a time to be thinking about, I only want to insure my torso. Let's insure the whole darn thing and make sure that it's robust going forward in the future.
And I 100% agree with you, Malcolm. It is not the time to tighten the belt, but the issue is there will be belt tightening. We are certainly advocating for it not to happen, but the writing is on the wall.
Look at the sectors that we've had to bail out then, not the agri-food sector.
Agreed. And I, you're preaching to the converted on this one. There's absolutely no doubt on that front. I'm going to ask for a minute answers because I do want to go through another question before we end it. John.
Very, very quickly, I would say the government's already doing this, but do more of it, harmonize regulatory, so a Canadian company can get Health Canada approval and can roll it out through a number of different countries. I think that would be valuable. Second, make sure the business environment is competitive with our jurisdictions that we compete with.
Great. Peter, short answer.
Yeah, I'm going to riff off Malcolm's point. I think we need to tell a better story. There's three big things that we don't do a very good job of. This is a high return sector.
Yes.
That's not the perception in Ottawa. Not only is it a high ROI, it's generating jobs, good paying jobs now. So it's not a declining industry, but that's the view in many parts of Ottawa. Second, we have a moral obligation. We're one of the 5 countries that actually exports protein. You know, if we shrink, the world is worse off. And third, land, the one thing we can uniquely contribute to the global conversation about climate change is how we better use our land and food resources. And we are at the cutting edge in many of those areas where we're not only reducing our footprint, we're actually becoming a sink in some parts of our industry. Those are all part of the grand challenges that are part of the strategic development goals. Canada, this isn't a parochial investment. This is a global investment. So we're not investing for Canadians, we're investing for 7.5 to 8 billion people. That's the pitch that the industry needs to make, not a parochial little, you know, gee, we got to compete against autos and airplanes, because autos and airplanes won't feed the world and solve the world's problems.
And Peter, I think we are making the point. I don't know if you saw our op-ed in the Western Producer not long ago. It certainly was to make the point. We the narrative in Ottawa, 100% agreement with you. We got AFC to agree and to state that agri-food research and innovation at the highest return on investment of all the sectors they looked at. That was stated by one of their directors. That doesn't mean that Finance Canada understands that, and that's a key problem. And that certainly doesn't mean that the people in the Prime Minister's office understand that as well. So we need to continue to work, and this is why, in a good part, AIC exists and has a role on this. I'm going to, the reason I wanted to go through this as well is we have Ron Carrick, and who's asking a question, and I think it's a good idea to go back to this a little bit. You know, his question is whether or not we need to deal with regions rather than provinces. Actually, why does AAFC need to deal with regions rather than provinces? We do not have a regional political structure or 5 provinces. We have 10 provinces, 3 territories, and indeed he works for one of them in Saskatchewan, and that's part of the reason probably we were getting this question. And his second part of the statement is groupthink and national policy is not always the best way forward. Duplication is not always the bad thing. Approaching problems. So that's a different point of view than what some of you have expressed. Can you have very short answers to this? And I'm going to ask you, Martin, to reply to this, because ultimately you are investing and you're choosing who you're going to invest in, and the government is a partner in that in a way. What do you want to see? More government, more federal government involvement, or more or less putting it back to the provinces?
Well, this is more to the policy domain, or as not so much the investing domain. I don't particularly care where the innovation comes from, but it's always going to be better if there's an alignment that these are the things that are interesting and important. And if the various regional areas, provinces, somewhat arbitrary terminology perhaps, but if they're all working towards common problems and solving common problems and good solutions, that's beneficial for everyone. So I don't really have a good answer to this question.
And that's fine, Martin. Malcolm, do you want to take a 30-second stab to this?
Yeah, I think it's a tough route to go. We've tried to play the Captain Canada route here before, and there's just not a huge appetite for it. We're so embedded in and has such a strong history of provincialism, let alone regionalism. And I love the concept, but I just don't know if there's an appetite for it either federally or provincially, unfortunately.
Great. John, 30-second answer.
I really have nothing to add. I agree with what they've said.
And Peter, I'm never going to ask you 30 seconds. I'll give you 40 seconds.
No, it's good. I think we have a dynamic ecosystem, and everybody needs to learn how to lead, follow, or get out of the way. Too often governments, national, provincial, regional, want to control the system. That I think we all need to get better at handing off. It's a relay. It's not a sprint or a long distance run.
Agreed. I do want to echo a statement made on the chat, which was not open to attendees, but visibly got open to attendees from Dr. Deborah Buzzard, who was on our policy committee, and I invite our attendees to look at AIC and the policy, the committee work that we're doing, and to develop policies. And Deborah was saying that this is an excellent panel and a great discussion, and I do echo that statement. Thank you to all of you for doing this. We have 4 minutes to spare. I'm not going to launch another question within 4 minutes to spare. I think that would be silly, but I'm going to thank all of you for doing this. And I'm going to also invite everybody to come back to our next webinar, which will be scheduled on July 8th, when we discuss gene editing implications for the agri-food sector. So a very different question. And I will remember all attendees that if you're a member of AIC, this webinar series is free. If you're an institutional corporate member of AIC, your staff, your students, Malcolm, we haven't seen too many students or faculty from Guelph. We need to distribute the message, but it's also free. Thank you very much, everyone.
We'll make sure to get them there, Serge. I'll tell them that the next conversation is likely to be a crisper one than this one. It's my gene editing joke.
There we go. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great rest of the day. A beautiful day across the country, in most parts of the country anyway. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Thank you.